What would you do if the person who promised to love you became the person trying to destroy you? Nora Brennan had everything: a thriving architecture career, a tech CEO husband, and a baby on the way. Then she discovered the affair. When she asked for a divorce, Grant didn't just say no. He launched a calculated campaign to take everything from her: her career, her reputation, her savings, and ultimately, her newborn daughter. But Grant made one critical mistake. He underestimated her. This is the true cost of loving the wrong person and the price of fighting back. If you've ever felt powerless against someone with more money and connections, you need to hear this story. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you never miss our stories of justice and survival. Nora Brennan stood at the podium in City Hall, her hand resting protectively on her 6-month baby bump. The architectural rendering on the screen behind her showed her latest design: a women's shelter with floor-to-ceiling windows that invited light into spaces where darkness had once reigned. "Every woman deserves a place where she feels safe," Nora said, her voice steady and passionate. "This shelter isn't just about four walls and a roof. It's about dignity. It's about hope." The city council members nodded approvingly. 3 of them had already committed their votes. This project, 2 years in the making, was finally becoming reality. Nora gathered her presentation materials, feeling the familiar thrill of accomplishment that came with every successful pitch. Her phone buzzed. A text from Grant. "Running late, don't wait up." She read it twice, feeling that familiar hollow sensation in her chest. Running late had become his default status over the past year. Their conversations had dwindled to logistics and text messages. When was the last time they'd actually talked, really talked, about anything beyond his meetings and her deadlines? Nora drove home to their apartment in Tribeca, a sleek 2-bedroom with industrial windows overlooking the Hudson River. Grant had signed the lease 3 years ago, right after Titan Core Security had secured its second round of funding. Everything was in his name. At the time, it had seemed practical. His credit score was higher. His income was more stable. She was building her architecture practice from the ground. Now, the apartment felt less like home and more like a hotel where she happened to store her clothes. She spread her drawings across the dining table, losing herself in the design for a community center in Brooklyn. Hours passed. Her phone showed 1 in the morning. Grant still wasn't home. This wasn't unusual. Titan Core had grown from a scrappy startup to an $800 million company in 5 years. Grant's calendar was an endless parade of investor meetings, product launches, and crisis management. She understood the pressure. She really did. But understanding didn't make the loneliness any easier. At 2:30 in the morning, she heard his key in the lock. Grant walked in, loosening his tie, not quite meeting her eyes. "Hey," he said, "you're still up. Where were you?" "I told you. Client dinner ran late. Then we went back to the office to finalize the contract." He headed toward the bedroom. "I'm exhausted." Nora noticed something on the table by the door, a receipt that had fallen from his pocket. She picked it up while he was in the bathroom. Harry Winston Jewelers, $5,300. Yesterday's date. Her heart started pounding. She opened her jewelry box. Nothing new. No surprise gift waiting for her. When Grant emerged, she held up the receipt. "Who did you buy jewelry for?" His expression flickered, just for a second, before smoothing into practiced calm. "That's for you. Obviously, I'm saving it for a special occasion. You weren't supposed to see the receipt." "What occasion, Sham? Does it matter? Can't I buy my wife something nice?" He took the receipt from her hand. "You're always so suspicious lately. It's exhausting." That word, exhausting. As if her completely reasonable question was somehow a burden on him. "I'm sorry," she heard herself say. We barely talk anymore. I'm building something." "Nora, I thought you understood that." He climbed into bed, turning his back to her. "Some of us are actually trying to secure our family's future." The implication hung in the air. Some of us. As if her architecture work was a hobby instead of a career. As if her awards and commissions meant nothing. She stood in the doorway, watching her husband's back, and felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Something was wrong. She couldn't name it, couldn't prove it, but every instinct screamed that the man in their bed was becoming a stranger. The next morning, Grant left before she woke up. She made herself tea and opened her laptop to review client emails. That's when she noticed it. Grant's iPad, sitting on the kitchen counter. He'd forgotten it, and it was unlocked. She shouldn't look. She knew she shouldn't, but her hand reached for it anyway. The Messages app was open, a conversation thread at the top, marked with a red heart emoji. The contact name was just a letter V. Nora's finger hovered over the screen. This was a violation of privacy. This was crossing a line. She tapped the conversation. The first message she saw made her stomach drop. I love you too. Can't wait for this weekend. She scrolled up and up and up. 18 months of messages. Photos, explicit texts, plans for weekend getaways, declarations of love. A parallel relationship conducted right under her nose. The woman's name was Vanessa Quinn. She worked at Titan Corp, corporate attorney. Nora had met her once at a company party. Striking, ambitious, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Nora's hands started shaking so violently she almost dropped the iPad. The baby kicked, as if sensing her distress. She pressed her palm against her belly, trying to breathe, trying to think. This weekend. They had plans this weekend. A reservation confirmation for a bed and breakfast in the Berkshires. While she was 6 months pregnant with his child, the front door opened. Grant was back. Forgot my iPad, he called out. Then he saw her face, saw what she was holding. His expression shifted from surprise to calculation in less than a second. Nora, he said carefully. Let me explain. Nora held up the iPad, her voice shaking. 18 months. Grant, you've been with her for 18 months. He didn't deny it. That was almost worse than the affair itself. No scrambling for excuses, no desperate apologies, just a cold assessment of the situation. Like this was a business problem requiring damage control. I was going to tell you that, he said finally, when after the baby was born, after your weekend getaway. She scrolled through the messages, her voice rising. You told her you loved her, multiple times, while I was home, pregnant, designing our future. You were planning a life with someone else. Grant's jaw tightened. You want to talk about this now, fine. Let's talk about it. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, taking his time, making her wait. You're never here. Nor emotionally, I mean, everything is about your projects, your deadlines, your next big commission. She stared at him, incredulous. Are you seriously blaming me for your affair? I'm explaining context. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Vanessa gets it. She understands the pressure I'm under. She's there when I need to talk, when I need support. Where are you buried in blueprints, obsessing over window placements and structural integrity? I'm growing our child. The words came out as a shout. I'm 6 months pregnant, Grant, which is exactly why you should be focusing on that instead of working 80-hour weeks. He shook his head, as if she were the unreasonable one. But no, you can't let go of control. You can't just be present. Nora felt like she was losing her mind somehow in the span of 5 minutes. He'd twisted the narrative until she was the one being accused. This was gaslighting. She knew the term. She'd read about it, but experiencing it was different, disorienting. I want you to leave, she said. Grant laughed. Actually laughed. This is my apartment. Nora, my lease, my name on the contract. Cold reality hit her like a physical blow. He was right. When they'd moved in, his income was 6 times hers. His credit score was pristine. The landlord had barely glanced at her information. She'd signed as an authorized occupant, not a leaseholder. Then I'll leave, she said. With what money? He tilted his head, studying her like a specimen. Your architecture firm pays you, what, $70,000 a year. How are you going to afford first month, last month, security deposit, and a broker's fee in New York City? While pregnant, she felt the walls closing in. I have savings. Do you? He pulled out his phone, tapping through screens. Because according to our joint account, there's $8,400 in there. That'll cover maybe 2 months of rent in a decent neighborhood. Then what? Our joint account. Another thing in his name that she'd simply been added to. How had she been so naive? The prenup, she whispered, remembering the document she'd signed 3 years ago. Grant's lawyer had presented it a week before their wedding. She'd been so in love, so certain they were building a life together. The idea of a prenup had seemed like a formality, something rich people did. She'd barely read it before signing. The prenup states that in the event of divorce, you receive $20,000 in whatever personal property you brought into the marriage. Grant's voice was clinical now, like he was reading from a contract, which essentially he was, I keep the business, the investments, the real estate. You get a lump sum, and we go our separate ways. $20,000. That's what 3 years of marriage was worth to him. I helped build Titan Core, she said desperately. I designed your headquarters. Everyone praised your innovative office design. That was my work, which you did as a favor for your husband. You never submitted an invoice. There's no contract, no paper trail. He shrugged. Try to claim otherwise and my lawyers will bury you in paperwork. Nora sank into a chair, her mind reeling. This wasn't the man she'd married. Or maybe it was, and she'd simply refused to see it. The charm, the ambition, the drive that had attracted her, those same qualities made him ruthless when protecting his interests. What about our baby? She asked quietly. Something flickered across his face. For a brief moment, she saw genuine emotion. Uncertainty. Maybe, but it vanished quickly, replaced by that same calculated expression. I'll support my child. I'm not a monster. He set down his water bottle. But if you try to take me to the cleaners in divorce court, if you make this difficult, I will fight for custody. And Nora, he leaned forward. I have resources you can't imagine. The best lawyers in New York, expert witnesses, connections to judges and mediators. What do you have? The threat hung in the air between them. He would take their baby. He was telling her, explicitly, that he would use their child as leverage. I want a divorce, she said, her voice hollow. Then file. He picked up his iPad. I'll have my attorney contact you. He walked out of the kitchen, leaving her sitting alone at the table. Through the window, the Hudson River glittered in the morning light. The city spread out before her, indifferent to her pain. Nora placed both hands on her belly, feeling the baby move. 7 weeks ago, she'd been excited to tell Grant they were having a girl. He'd nodded, said, "That's great," and gone back to his phone. She'd told herself he was stressed. She'd made excuses. She'd ignored every red flag because acknowledging them meant admitting her marriage was a lie. Now she had no choice but to see the truth. And the truth was terrifying. Grant Holloway had all the power, the money, the lawyers, the connections. She had a $70,000 salary, $8,000 in savings, and a baby coming in 3 months. But she also had something he'd underestimated: the will to survive. She'd built an architecture practice from nothing. She'd won awards competing against firms with decades of experience. She wasn't going to let him destroy her. Nora pulled out her phone and started searching for divorce attorneys. The first consultation was free. She'd figure out the rest as she went. She had to. Ruth Brennan's apartment in Queens was a stark contrast to the Tribeca penthouse. 1,200 square feet, rent stabilized since 1992, with radiator heat that clanked through winter nights. But it was home. It was safe. He said what? Ruth stared at her daughter across the kitchen table, her coffee mug frozen halfway to her mouth. Nora repeated Grant's threat about custody, watching her mother's face cycle through shock, rage, and finally a determined calm that Nora recognized from childhood. Ruth had raised 2 kids on a teacher's salary after their father left. She knew how to fight. We need a lawyer, Ruth said. A good one. That afternoon, Nora sat in a glass-walled conference room on the 37th floor of a midtown office building. Meredith Cross was exactly what she'd hoped for: sharp, experienced, with a reputation for winning complex divorce cases. Meredith reviewed the prenup, making notes on her legal pad. She was maybe 45, wearing a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than Nora's monthly salary. This is a tough prenup, Meredith said finally. But it's not ironclad. Nora felt hope spark in her chest for the first time in days. What do you mean of several things? Meredith tapped her pen against the document. First, you signed this one week before your wedding. That's cutting it close to what we call duress. The argument is that you were under emotional pressure. The wedding was planned, Guests invited. Backing out would have been socially and financially devastating. I remember feeling rushed, Nora said. Like I had no choice. Good. That's relevant. Moshoop Meredith flipped to another page. Second, you mentioned you designed Titan Core's headquarters. Tell me about that. Nora explained how Grant had asked her to consult on the office design 2 years ago. She'd spent 3 months developing the concept and open floor plan with soundproof privacy pods, natural light optimization, biophilic design elements. Tech publications had praised Titan Core's innovative workspace. Grant had been featured in Wired magazine, talking about how the office design reflected the company's forward-thinking culture. Did you bill for this work? Meredith asked. No, he said it was a favor. I was helping my husband's business. Nora felt stupid admitting it. Do you have emails about the project? Any documentation showing your contribution? Yes, lots. Grant would send me feedback. We'd discuss changes. It's all in writing. Meredith smiled. Then we have an argument for marital asset contribution. You provided professional services that enhanced the company's value and public image. That's worth something, potentially a lot. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. By the end, Nora felt cautiously optimistic. Meredith outlined a strategy challenge the prenup. Document Nora's contributions to Grant's success. Build a case for fair spousal support and child custody. I'm not going to lie to you, Meredith said as they wrapped up. This will be expensive. My retainer is $25,000. But I believe we can get you a settlement that's substantially better than $20,000. You deserve that. $25,000. Nora's entire savings wouldn't cover it. Ruth had offered to take out a loan against her pension, but Nora couldn't let her mother do that. I need some time, Nora said, to figure out the finances. Of course, but don't wait too long. The sooner we file, the better. Meredith walked her to the elevator. You're doing the right thing. Grant Holloway doesn't get to steamroll you just because he has money. Nora left the building feeling lighter than she had in weeks. She had a plan. She had a lawyer who believed in her case. This was going to work out. 2 days later, Meredith called. Nora, I'm so sorry. I have to withdraw from your case. The words didn't make sense at first. What? Why? My firm's largest client gave us an ultimatum this morning. Meredith's voice was strained. If we represent you, they'll take their business elsewhere. We're talking about $18 million in annual billings. The managing partners are furious, but their hands are tied. Who's the client? I can't say. Attorney-client privilege. But Meredith paused. I did some digging. The company is a subsidiary of Titan Core, 3 layers removed, but the ownership chain is there. Nora felt sick. Grant did this. His lawyer did. Walter Pritchard. He's connected to every major firm in Manhattan. I should have anticipated this. Meredith sounded genuinely upset. I'm recommending you to 3 other attorneys. Hopefully one of them can take your case. But the same thing happened with all 3. One firm's managing partner had a personal relationship with Walter Pritchard. Another firm represented Titan Core in an unrelated matter and cited conflict of interest. The third firm simply said they were at capacity. By the end of the week, Nora had contacted 12 firms. The answer was always the same. No one would touch her case. She was being blacklisted. Finally, through a friend of a friend, she found Dale Garrison. His office was in a strip mall in Jackson Heights, sandwiched between a tax preparation service and a nail salon. The walls were lined with sagging bookshelves filled with legal texts. His desk was buried under case files. Dale was maybe 50, with gray hair and tired eyes. He listened to her story, nodding occasionally. I'm going to be straight with you, he said when she finished. I'm a sole practitioner. I handle divorce cases, some real estate law, small claims. I don't have associates. I don't have a team of paralegals. And I definitely don't have the resources to go up against Walter Pritchard and his army of lawyers. But you'll take my case. Yeah, I'll take it. Because what Grant Holloway is doing is bullshit, and somebody needs to push back. Dale pulled out a standard retainer agreement. My fee is $5,000. I'll do my best. But you need to understand we're outgunned. Significantly. Nora signed the papers. Dale was all she had. The relief she'd felt after meeting Meredith was gone, replaced by a cold understanding of just how powerful Grant really was. He could make phone calls and destroy her legal options. He could deploy his wealth like a weapon. But at least she had someone in her corner. That had to count for something. The process server showed up at Ruth's apartment on a Wednesday morning. Nora was making tea when the doorbell rang. The man handed her a thick manila envelope with an apologetic expression. "Sorry about this," he said before leaving. Inside were 3 separate filings. Nora's hands shook as she read through them. Grant was filing for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Standard. He was contesting any financial claims beyond the prenuptial agreement. Expected. And he was filing for full custody of their unborn child. Nora stopped breathing. The words swam on the page. Petitioner seeks primary physical custody with limited supervised visitation for respondent due to documented mental instability and behavior patterns that pose a risk to the minor child's well-being. Mental instability. The phrase appeared 6 times in the filing. Exhibit A was a declaration from Grant stating that Nora had abandoned the marital home in an erratic manner. She'd moved out after discovering his affair, but his lawyer made it sound like she'd fled in the middle of the night without cause. Exhibit B referenced her obsessive focus on work to the detriment of personal relationships. Translation: she was a workaholic who couldn't prioritize family. Exhibit C was the most damaging. Grant claims she'd violated his privacy by illegally accessing his personal communications. The iPad, he was using her discovery of his affair as evidence against her. The filing requested a psychological evaluation for both parties and an emergency hearing to establish temporary custody arrangements. Ruth read over her shoulder, her face going pale. "This is insane. You're the most stable person I know." "It doesn't matter what's true." Nora's voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else. "It matters what he can prove." She called Dale immediately. He arrived at the apartment within an hour, reviewing the documents with a deepening frown. "This is aggressive," he said. "Pritchard is throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks." The good news is that most judges see through these tactics. The bad news is that we have to respond to every allegation, which takes time and money. "Can he really take my baby?" Nora asked. Dale hesitated. That pause told her everything she needed to know. "New York courts favor joint custody," he said carefully. "But in cases where one parent is deemed unfit or unstable, they'll grant primary custody to the other parent. Grant is building a narrative. We need to counter it." "How?" "The psych evaluation is mandatory once he's requested it. You'll meet with a court-appointed psychologist. Just be honest, be calm. Show them you're a reasonable person dealing with a difficult situation." The evaluation was scheduled for the following week. Nora spent the intervening days in a state of barely controlled panic. She read articles about custody battles, joined online support groups, tried to prepare herself for what was coming. The psychologist's office was in a medical building near the courthouse. Dr. Elizabeth Warner was maybe 60, with reading glasses on a chain and a kind but detached demeanor. The walls were beige. The art was inoffensive landscapes. Everything designed to be neutral, unthreatening. "This is just a conversation," Dr. Warner said, settling into her chair with a yellow legal pad. "I'm going to ask you some questions about your mental health, your relationship with Grant, and your plans for the baby. Just be honest." The questions started innocently enough. How was she feeling? Was she sleeping well? Any history of depression or anxiety? Then they got more pointed. "Do you experience mood swings?" "I mean, I'm pregnant," Nora said. "My hormones are all over the place." Dr. Warner made a note. "How would you describe your emotional state when you discovered your husband's affair?" "I was devastated, angry, betrayed." "Did you consider harming yourself or others?" "What? No, never." "Did you engage in any impulsive behavior, make any rash decisions?" Nora thought about moving out, calling lawyers, confronting Grant. Were those rash decisions or rational responses? "I left an unsafe situation," she said carefully. "My husband was having an affair. I needed space to think." More notes. The questions continued for 90 minutes. By the end, Nora felt like every answer had been twisted into evidence of instability. Her justified anger became mood swings. Her decision to leave became abandonment. Her discovery of the affair became a privacy violation. 2 weeks later, Dr. Warner's report arrived. Dale called after reading it. "It's not great," when he said. The report described Nora as showing signs of emotional dysregulation consistent with prenatal stress and noted her fixation on perceived marital wrongs and difficulty accepting responsibility for relationship breakdown. None of it was technically false, but the framing made her sound unstable, obsessive, a woman whose emotional state might pose risks to a child. This is what Grant wanted, Dale explained. Pritchard picked this evaluator. She has a history of writing reports that favor his clients. That's legal. Technically, she's court-appointed, but Pritchard knows which evaluators lean which way. It's a rigged game, and we're playing from behind. The custody hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, Grant's lawyers filed a motion requesting that, upon birth, the baby be placed with Grant pending the full hearing. They cited the psychological evaluation and Nora's unstable living situation, Ruth's apartment. They were calling her mother's home unstable. Dale fought the motion, but Nora could see the writing on the wall. Grant had the money, the lawyers, the connections. He was building an impenetrable case, piece by piece, and she was running out of options. The email from Hudson Medical Center arrived on a Monday morning. Nora read it 3 times, trying to make sense of the words. Dear Ms. Brennan, after careful consideration, we have decided to move in a different direction for our expansion project. We appreciate your work on the preliminary designs and will compensate you per our contract for services rendered to date. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. The Hudson Medical expansion was her biggest project. 2 years of work, hundreds of hours of community meetings, zoning board presentations, design revisions. It was supposed to break ground next month. She called her contact at the hospital, a facilities director named Tom Parker. Tom, what happened? The board approved my design. Nora, I'm sorry, I really am. Tom sounded genuinely uncomfortable. This came from higher up. They brought in a consultant. He had concerns about the budget, and they decided to pause the project. What consultant? Titan Core Security. They're reviewing all our vendor relationships as part of a campus-wide security assessment. The phone almost slipped from Nora's hand. Grant's company. I didn't make the connection until afterwards, Tom said. By the time I realized the decision was made, I went to bat for you, but... He trailed off. She knew how the sentence ended, but Grant Holloway is very persuasive. 3 days later, the Riverside Community Center canceled their contract. A week after that, a residential development in Brooklyn withdrew their offer. Every project Nora had in the pipeline suddenly hit complications. Her firm noticed. Of course they noticed. Harrison & Associates was a mid-sized architecture firm with 12 partners and 40 employees. Nora had joined as a junior architect 7 years ago, worked her way up to senior associate, and was on track for partner consideration. Bill Harrison called her into his office on a Friday afternoon. He was 60, a legend in affordable housing design, and someone Nora had always respected. Nora, we need to talk about your situation, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. What situation? Your divorce. It's affecting the firm. She felt her face flush. How is my personal life affecting business? 3 clients have canceled contracts with you. 2 potential clients declined to work with us after learning you'd be the lead architect. Bill folded his hands on his desk. I got a call from Robert Marsh at the Architectural Review Board. He mentioned that Grant Holloway's attorney had reached out to him. Walter Pritchard. He didn't say anything actionable. Just casually mentioned in that you were going through a difficult time, that your judgment might be compromised. Bill looked pained. Robert's a friend. He gave me a heads up. Pritchard is making calls, planting seeds of doubt. Nora wanted to scream. Instead, she kept her voice level. So what are you saying? I think you should take a leave of absence, just until the baby is born and your personal situation stabilizes. Bill hurried to add, it's not punitive. You'd keep your benefits. We'd even continue your salary at 50%. You're benching me. I'm protecting the firm. And honestly, Nora, I'm protecting you, Tom. You need to focus on your divorce and your pregnancy. Trying to work through this is only going to make things harder. She wanted to argue, but what was the point? Harrison & Associates was cutting its losses. She was a liability now. When do you want me gone? She asked. Take the rest of the day. We'll formalize everything on Monday. Nora walked out of the office in a daze. Josie Miller, A young architect who'd been Nora's intern 3 years ago caught up with her in the hallway. I heard, Josie said quietly. This is bullshit. It's business. It's blackmail. Everyone knows what Grant's doing. Josie glanced around, lowered her voice. For what it's worth, I think you're brilliant, and I think you're going to land on your feet. Nora appreciated the sentiment, even if she couldn't believe it. That night, lying in bed at Ruth's apartment, Nora calculated her financial situation. With 50% salary, her benefits would cover medical expenses. Ruth refused to accept rent. She could survive for a few months. But after the baby came, after the custody hearing, if she lost, she'd owe Dale for additional legal work. If she won, she'd need to find childcare and rebuild her career from scratch. Either way, she was trapped. Grant had systematically destroyed her professional reputation, isolated her from high-powered legal help, and painted her as an unstable woman who couldn't handle stress. And the worst part, it was all perfectly legal. He hadn't broken any laws. He'd simply used his wealth and connections to make her life impossible. Ruth knocked softly on the door. You okay, sweetheart? No, Nora said honestly. I'm really not. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed, stroking Nora's hair like she'd done when Nora was a child. Isaac wants to go talk to Grant. I told him absolutely not. But he's pretty angry. Nora's brother was a firefighter in Brooklyn, 6'3" and built like a linebacker. The image of him confronting Grant was almost funny. Almost. Tell him to stay away, Nora said. Grant would love nothing more than to claim I sent my brother to threaten him. That's what I figured. Ruth kept stroking her hair. You're going to get through this. I don't know how yet, but you will. Nora wanted to believe her, but lying in the dark, feeling her baby kick, she couldn't see a way forward. Every path was blocked. Every option closed off. Grant Holloway held all the cards, and he was playing to win. The contractions started during a particularly brutal nightmare about losing the baby. Nora woke up gasping, her abdomen clenching with pain that felt nothing like the Braxton Hicks contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. She checked her phone 3:15 in the morning. Ruth was asleep in the next room. Isaac was on a 48-hour shift. Another contraction hit, stronger this time. Nora pressed her hand to her belly, trying to breathe through it. She was only 31 weeks pregnant. This couldn't be labor. It was too early. She waited, timing the contractions. 5 minutes apart. 4 minutes. 3. Panic set in. She called 911, trying to keep her voice steady. The operator told her an ambulance was on the way. The hospital was controlled chaos. Nurses hooked her up to monitors, checked her vitals, called for the attending obstetrician. The baby's heartbeat was erratic. Nora's blood pressure was dangerously high. We're seeing signs of preeclampsia, the doctor explained. Her voice calm, but urgent. Combined with preterm labor, we're going to try to stop the contractions. But if we can't, we'll need to deliver. It's too early, Nora whispered. Babies born at 31 weeks do very well with proper neonatal care. But right now, we're going to do everything we can to keep her inside where she's safest. They pumped her full of medications. Magnesium sulfate to prevent seizures. Steroids to help the baby's lungs develop faster. Something else to stop the contractions. The world became a blur of beeping machines and worried faces. Ruth arrived, out of breath from running through the hospital. She held Nora's hand while nurses adjusted IV drips. You're going to be fine, Ruth said, her voice shaking. Both of you. The contractions slowed. The baby's heartbeat stabilized. By noon, the crisis seemed to be passing. The doctor ordered bed rest, at least a week in the hospital for monitoring. That's when the nurses mentioned they'd called her emergency contact. What emergency contact? Nora asked. Your husband. It's listed in your file. Grant walked in 20 minutes later, looking appropriately concerned. He wore a tailored suit and carried a bouquet of flowers. To any observer, he was the perfect worried husband. Nora, he said, moving to her bedside. Thank God you're okay. Get out, she said. I know things are complicated between us, but this isn't the time. He glanced at Ruth. Mrs. Brennan, could you give us a moment? No, Ruth said firmly. I'm staying. Grant's expression hardened, but he maintained his concerned husband act. The nurses told me you're in preterm labor. that the stress has been affecting your health. He addressed this to the doctor. Is the baby in danger? The situation is stable now, the doctor said carefully. But Miss Brennan will need complete bed rest and stress reduction. Of course, whatever she needs. Grant turned back to Nora. I've been worried about you. The divorce proceedings have been difficult for everyone. Maybe we should talk about pausing things until after the baby arrives. It sounded reasonable, caring even, but Nora saw the calculation behind his eyes. He was performing for the hospital staff, building a narrative. Leave, she said again. I'm the father of your child. I have a right to be here. He pulled out his phone, showing the doctor something on the screen. I have court documents establishing paternity and my petition for custody evaluation. I'm a concerned parent. The doctor looked uncomfortable. This is a medical facility, not a courtroom. If Ms. Brennan doesn't want you here, I have to ask you to leave. Grant nodded, all understanding. Of course, I don't want to cause additional stress. He set the flowers on the bedside table. I'll be in the waiting room if you need anything. After he left, Nora started shaking. The monitors beeped faster as her heart rate spiked. That man, Ruth said to the doctor, is the reason she's in this hospital. By the next morning, Nora's condition had stabilized enough that they moved her from labor and delivery to the antepartum unit for long-term monitoring. She'd be there for at least a week, possibly longer. Dale came to visit that afternoon, carrying a stack of papers that made Nora's stomach drop. Grant filed an emergency motion, he said, sitting in the chair beside her bed. He's claiming your health crisis proves you're not capable of caring for a newborn. He wants temporary custody immediately upon birth, pending the full hearing. He caused this, Nora said, her voice breaking. The stress from his legal attacks, from destroying my career. This is all because of him. I know, but proving causation is difficult. Dale pulled out the motion. He's also submitted the hospital records showing you came in alone, that your blood pressure is dangerous, that you're at risk for preeclampsia. He's arguing that placing the baby with you after birth would be unsafe. Where's the hearing? Next week, Judge Harold Kemp. Nora recognized the name. Judge Kemp was known for being conservative in custody cases, for favoring stability and resources. Exactly the kind of judge who would look at Grant's wealth and connections and see a safer option than a single mother living in her mother's apartment. What are our chances, she asked. Dale didn't answer right away. We'll argue that with proper support. You can provide excellent care. We'll emphasize that separating a newborn from its mother is traumatic. We'll fight like hell. But his tone said what he couldn't, they were going to lose. That night, Nora lay in the hospital bed, hooked up to machines that monitored every flutter of her baby's heartbeat. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the movements that had become familiar over the past months. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. She tried to protect her daughter. She tried to fight back against Grant's assault, and she'd failed. In a week, maybe less, a judge would decide that Grant Holloway was the better parent, that his money and power outweighed Nora's love and determination. The machines beeped steadily in the dark. Somewhere down the hall, another woman was in labor, bringing a child into a world that was supposed to be joyful and safe. Nora closed her eyes and tried not to think about what came next. Maya Ruth Brennan entered the world at 6:43 on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks earlier than planned but healthy and strong. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, a shock of dark hair in her mother's blue eyes. Nora held her daughter for the first time and felt something shift inside her chest. This tiny human, perfect and vulnerable, depending entirely on her for survival, for love, for protection. Hi, baby girl, Nora whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'm your mama. Ruth stood beside the bed, openly sobbing. Isaac had rushed over from his shift, still wearing his FDNY t-shirt, his own eyes red. She's perfect, Ruth breathed. Absolutely perfect. They had 48 hours. That's what the emergency custody order specified. 48 hours for Nora to bond with her newborn daughter before handing her over to Grant pending the full custody hearing. The nurses were kind, teaching Nora how to breastfeed, how to change diapers, how to swaddle. They didn't mention the court order, but Nora saw the pity in their eyes. They knew. Oh. Those 48 hours were simultaneously the most beautiful and most heartbreaking of Nora's life. She memorized every detail of Maya's face, the way she scrunched her nose when she was hungry, the tiny sighs she made while sleeping, the grip of her impossibly small fingers around Nora's thumb. Ruth barely left the room, helping with feedings, rocking Maya when Nora needed to rest. Isaac came back with supplies, diapers, onesies, a stuffed rabbit, for when you get her back, he said firmly. Not if, when. On the second night, Dale called with news. Nora put him on speaker so Ruth could hear. Grant's company is under investigation. Dale said, excitement in his voice. The SEC on 900 this morning. Insider trading allegations related to a merger last year. Nora's exhausted brain struggled to process this. What does that mean for us? It means his character is suddenly in question. If he's under federal investigation, that affects the custody case. I filed a motion this afternoon to delay the transfer pending the investigation's outcome. For the first time in months, Nora felt genuine hope. Will the judge grant it? Judge Kemp is conservative, but he's also fair. If there's a credible investigation into Grant's business practices, he'll want to see how it plays out before making permanent custody decisions. Dale paused. The hearing is tomorrow at 2. I'll present the motion. This could buy us time. Nora looked down at Maya, sleeping in her arms. Time. That's all she needed. Time to gather evidence. Time to rebuild. Time to prove she was the better parent. Thank you, Dale. Don't thank me yet. Let's see what Kemp says. The next morning, Ruth stayed with Maya while Nora dressed in the one professional outfit she'd brought to the hospital. A simple gray dress, low heels, minimal makeup. She needed to look like a competent mother, not an emotional wreck. The courthouse was in Lower Manhattan, a granite building that had seen generations of family disputes. Nora met Dale in the hallway outside the courtroom. He looked tired but determined. Pritchard's here, he said, nodding toward Grant's attorney. Walter Pritchard was 70, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Nora's entire wardrobe. He exuded old money confidence. Grant stood beside him, perfectly composed. When he saw Nora, his expression didn't change. No acknowledgement, no emotion, like she was a stranger. Inside the courtroom, Judge Kemp reviewed the motions from behind his bench. He was 60, with reading glasses and a permanently skeptical expression. Mr. Garrison, you're asking for a delay in custody transfer based on an SEC investigation into Mr. Holloway's company. Kemp said, explain why this is relevant. Dale stood. Your Honor, the investigation raises serious questions about Mr. Holloway's judgment and character. If he's engaged in criminal financial activity, that's directly relevant to his fitness as a parent. Pritchard rose smoothly. Your Honor, my client hasn't been charged with any crime. The investigation is in its preliminary stages and may result in no action whatsoever. Ms. Brennan is grasping at straws to avoid complying with your previous order. Your Honor, Dale pressed, we're simply asking for 30 days. Let the investigation develop. Let us see if charges are filed. A 30-day delay won't harm Mr. Holloway, but permanently separating a newborn from her mother based on incomplete information could cause irreparable harm. Judge Kemp considered this, looking between the attorneys. Nora held her breath. 30 days is reasonable, Kemp said finally. The custody transfer has stayed pending further developments in the SEC investigation. We'll reconvene in 30 days to assess the situation. Nora almost collapsed with relief. 30 days. A month with her daughter. Dale squeezed her arm. We got it. But as they left the courtroom, Pritchard caught up with them in the hallway. He was alone, Grant having gone ahead. Ms. Brennan, he said, his voice low and smooth. A word of advice. You're prolonging the inevitable. My client is willing to be generous with visitation, but fighting him will only make things worse. He's under investigation, Nora said. Investigation, not indictment. And even if charges are filed, which I doubt, it won't affect his custody rights. Pritchard adjusted his cufflinks. You're playing a game you can't win. Accept reality. He walked away before she could respond. Dale watched him go, his jaw tight. He's right about one thing. The SEC investigation might not matter. We need more. More what? Evidence, something concrete that proves Grant is unfit. Dale shook his head. But legally obtained, we can't afford any missteps. They had 30 days. It felt like a gift and a death sentence all at once. 72 hours after Judge Kemp granted the delay, Nora was woken by pounding on Ruth's apartment door. It was 6 in the morning. Maya was asleep in the bassinet beside Nora's bed. She opened the door to find 2 police officers. "Nora Brennan," the first officer asked. "Yes, we need you to come to the station. There are questions about an ongoing investigation." Her heart stopped. "What investigation?" "We'll explain at the station. You can call your attorney." They let her arrange for Ruth to watch Maya, then drove her to the precinct in Queens. The whole ride, Nora's mind raced. What had she done? What could they possibly want? At the station, a detective named Morris brought her to an interview room. Dale arrived 30 minutes later, looking confused and worried. "What's this about?" Dale asked. Detective Morris laid out a series of photographs on the table. They showed Nora in a coffee shop, talking to a man. In one photo, money was changing hands. "Do you know this man?" Morris asked. Nora studied the photos. "I met him at a coffee shop last week. He started talking to me about divorce. Said his wife had gone through something similar." "Did you hire him?" "Hire him for what?" Morris pulled out a business card. "Ronald Shaw, private investigator. He claims you hired him to conduct surveillance on Grant Holloway." "That's insane. I talked to him for maybe 10 minutes. I bought him a coffee because he seemed nice." Nora looked at Dale, panicked. "I didn't hire anyone." "We have recordings," Morris said, pressing play on a small device. Nora's voice, slightly tinny but clearly audible. "I need to find something to use against him. Something that proves he's not what he seems." She remembered that conversation. She'd been venting, talking about how Grant had destroyed her career, how he was manipulating the custody case. It was rhetoric, frustration, not an actual solicitation. "This is taken out of context," Dale said immediately. "Ms. Brennan was expressing frustration about her divorce. She didn't hire anyone." "Mr. Shaw has a signed contract," Morris countered, sliding a document across the table. It was a standard PI contract, dated 4 days ago. Nora's signature was at the bottom, except she'd never seen this document before. She'd never signed it. "That's not my signature," she said, her voice shaking. Morris looked skeptical. "Mr. Shaw also has a check from you, $500, signed." He showed her the check. It did look like her signature, close enough that someone who didn't know her might believe it. "I didn't write that check," Nora insisted. "I don't even have checks. My account is electronic only." Dale examined the check. "Who brought this to you?" "Mr. Shaw came in this morning, very concerned. Said Ms. Brennan hired him to illegally surveil Grant Holloway, including breaking into his office to plant listening devices. He wanted to come clean before things went too far." It clicked suddenly. The man in the coffee shop hadn't been sympathetic. He'd been gathering material for a setup. "This is a frame job," Dale said. "Grant Holloway arranged this." "That's a serious accusation," Morris said. "It's the truth." Dale's voice was hard. "My client is in a custody battle. Holloway has unlimited resources. This is character assassination." Morris didn't look convinced, but after 2 more hours of questioning, he let them go. No charges were filed, but the damage was done. That afternoon, Walter Pritchard filed an emergency motion with Judge Kemp. Attached was a police report about the private investigator incident, complete with the forged contract in check. "Ms. Brennan engaged in illegal harassment and surveillance of my client." The motion stated, "She has demonstrated a pattern of obsessive, unstable behavior that poses a risk to the minor child. We request immediate enforcement of the original custody order." The hearing was scheduled for the next day. Judge Kemp's chambers, not the courtroom. The speed was unusual, but Pritchard had pulled strings. Nora sat across from Kemp's massive desk, Dale beside her. Grant and Pritchard sat on the other side. The judge looked tired and annoyed. "Ms. Brennan, these allegations are serious," Kemp said. "Hiring a private investigator to conduct illegal surveillance." "I didn't hire anyone, Your Honor." Nora said, "I was set up. The police have evidence." A signed contract? A check? Forged evidence? Dale leaned forward. Your Honor, this reeks of manufactured drama. Mr. Holloway has the resources and motivation to create this situation. Pritchard laughed. Actually laughed. Your Honor, my client is a respected businessman. Miss Brennan is a woman who violated his privacy, stalked his employees, and now allegedly hired a PI for illegal surveillance. The pattern is clear. Judge Kemp removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. Mr. Garrison, can you prove forgery? Not in 24 hours, no. But given time, I've given you time. Kemp interrupted. 30 days to find evidence supporting your client's case. Instead, she's accumulated more evidence of instability. He put his glasses back on. The delay is revoked. The original custody order is reinstated. Miss Brennan will transfer custody of the minor child to Mr. Holloway tomorrow at 10 a.m. here at the courthouse. Your Honor, please. Dale started. My ruling stands. Ms. Brennan will have supervised visitation, 2 hours twice weekly, pending the full custody hearing in 60 days. Kemp stood. We're done here. Outside the courthouse, Nora couldn't breathe. Tomorrow, she had to give up Maya tomorrow. Dale was talking, saying something about appeals and emergency motions, but the words didn't register. All she could think about was her daughter's face, the way Maya looked at her while nursing, the tiny sounds she made while sleeping. She'd lost. Grant had won, and there was nothing she could do about it. The courthouse parking garage at 9:45 the next morning. Nora sat in Ruth's car, Maya in her arms, trying to memorize every detail of this moment. You don't have to do this, Isaac said from the driver's seat. We could leave, go somewhere he can't find us. That's kidnapping, Nora said quietly. I'd lose her forever. Ruth reached back from the passenger seat, squeezing Nora's knee. There has to be another way. But there wasn't. Nora had spent the night researching options, calling lawyers, looking for any loophole. The custody order was legal and binding. If she didn't comply, she'd be in contempt of court. Grant would get everything he wanted. At 9:55, she carried Maya into the courthouse. Grant waited in the family court lobby with Vanessa Quinn beside him. Vanessa, who'd destroyed Nora's marriage, now stood ready to play mother to Nora's child. A court officer supervised the transfer. Nora handed Maya to Grant, the baby starting to cry, sensing her mother's distress. It's okay, sweetheart, Nora whispered, tears streaming down her face. Mama loves you. I love you so much. Grant took Maya without a word. Vanessa made cooing sounds, reaching for the baby. Nora watched them walk away, her daughter's cries echoing through the lobby until they disappeared around a corner. She collapsed onto a bench, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. Ruth sat beside her, holding her while she fell apart. An hour later, still in the courthouse, a man approached them. He was maybe 40, with kind eyes and a notebook tucked under his arm. Ms. Brennan, he said gently, I'm Felix Strand. I'm an investigative journalist. I wonder if we could talk. Nora looked up, her face swollen from crying. About what? About Grant Holloway and Titan Core Security. They went to a coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse. Felix ordered 3 coffees and sat across from Nora and Ruth. I've been investigating a Titan Core for 8 months. Felix said, the SEC case is real, but it's bigger than insider trading. Grant Holloway has been systematically stealing intellectual property from his employees, using their innovations and claiming them as his own. He's also been blackmailing business partners who tried to leave the company. Can you prove it? Nora asked. I'm close, but I need an inside source. Someone who knows how he operates, who has access to documentation. Felix looked at her steadily. You were married to him for 3 years. You designed his headquarters. You must have emails, documents, something that shows his methods. Nora thought about their shared cloud storage, the email account they'd both used for household matters. Grant had never removed her access. He probably assumed she'd deleted everything. She hadn't. If I help you, she said slowly, and you publish a story, what happens to Grant? If the evidence is solid federal charges, the SEC will pursue criminal prosecution. His board will remove him. The company, Yatio, will collapse. Felix leaned forward. But I need to warn you, this is the nuclear option. You'll be burning bridges. There won't be a settlement. No negotiated peace. You'll be testifying against him. Dale had arrived halfway through Felix's explanation. If you do this, Dale said quietly, you're choosing the long game. It could take months, maybe a year. And during that time, Grant has Maya. Nora felt Ruth's hand on hers. Her mother's face was worried but resolute. What do you want to do? Sweetheart, Nora thought about Maya's face, about the 2-hour supervised visits twice a week. She thought about Grant's arrogance, his certainty that he'd won. She thought about all the other people he'd stepped on, all the employees whose work he'd stolen, all the partners he'd blackmailed into silence. I want justice, she said, and I want my daughter back. Over the next 6 months, Nora rebuilt her life with agonizing slowness. She moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in Astoria, using what little savings remained. She took a part-time position at a small architecture firm in Brooklyn, working on residential projects that paid the bills but didn't require the long hours she couldn't afford. Twice a week, she visited Maya at a supervised visitation center. A social worker sat in the corner, taking notes, while Nora played with her daughter for 2 hours. Maya was growing, changing, hitting milestones Nora only saw through this narrow window. It was torture, but Nora had a purpose now. Every evening after work, she met with Felix. She provided him with thousands of pages of documents, emails showing Grant taking credit for employee innovations, contracts with buried, non-compete clauses that were probably illegal, communications that proved he'd blackmailed former partners. Felix interviewed former Titan Core employees who'd been too afraid to speak out before. He traced shell companies Grant had created to hide assets. He built an ironclad case. Meanwhile, Dale quietly gathered evidence for the custody case. Daycare reports showing Maya coming in with diaper rash from inadequate care, a nanny who quit after 2 weeks, citing Grant's verbally abusive behavior. Small things that individually meant nothing, but together painted a picture. Grant was confident. His engagement to Vanessa ended when she realized being connected to him was professionally toxic, but he barely seemed to notice. He showed up to court hearings looking relaxed, certain of his victory. He had no idea the walls were closing in. The article published on a Tuesday morning, Titan Core built on lies and stolen dreams, ran as the cover story in a major business publication. Felix's investigation laid out 8 years of systematic fraud. By noon, Titan Core's stock had dropped 40%. By the end of the day, the board had suspended Grant pending an internal investigation. The SEC announced criminal charges, 12 counts of securities fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Grant's bail was set at $5 million, which he posted immediately. But his empire was crumbling. Former employees came forward with their own stories. Business partners filed lawsuits. The company Grant had built, the one he'd protected so ruthlessly, was collapsing. 2 weeks after the article published, Nora filed an emergency custody petition. The evidence she and Dale had gathered, combined with Grant's criminal charges, painted a devastating picture. The hearing was in front of a different judge. Judge Harold Kemp had recused himself after questions emerged about his country club membership at a club where Walter Pritchard was on the board. Judge Maria Santos was younger, with a reputation for being tough but fair. She reviewed the evidence methodically, the daycare reports, the nanny's statement, Grant's increasing instability as his legal troubles mounted. Mr. Holloway, Santos said, looking at Grant over her reading glasses, you're facing federal criminal charges. You're under immense stress. Your former nanny describes you as erratic and inattentive. The daycare has filed 3 reports of neglect. Walter Pritchard stood. Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence. These charges are, I'm not ruling on his guilt or innocence. Santos interrupted. I'm ruling on the best interests of the child. And placing a 15-month-old with a parent facing federal prosecution who's demonstrated inadequate care is not in her best interest. She ruled for Nora full physical custody, with Grant receiving supervised visitation pending the resolution of his criminal case. Nora left the courthouse in a daze. Ruth and Isaac were waiting outside. Dale had tears in his eyes. You got her back, Dale said simply. That afternoon, Nora picked up Maya from Grant's apartment. The social worker supervised the transfer. Grant looked nothing like the confident CEO who'd destroyed her life 18 months ago. He was gaunt, exhausted, with the hollow eyes of someone watching everything fall apart. She needs her pajamas, he said quietly, handing Nora a bag. And her rabbit, she can't sleep without it. For just a moment, Nora saw genuine pain in his face. Love for his daughter, buried under all the narcissism and cruelty. You can see her, Nora said. Once a week, supervised. I won't keep her from you. Why? He looked genuinely confused. After everything I did to you. Because she's your daughter, and because I'm not you. 6 months later, Grant pleaded guilty to 7 federal charges in exchange for prosecutors dropping the rest. He was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Titancore was acquired by a larger firm and broken up for parts. The employees whose work Grant had stolen received financial settlements. The SEC investigation became a case study in corporate fraud. Nora visited Grant in prison once. He'd asked to see her, and she agreed, though she wasn't sure why. They sat across from each other in the visiting room, separated by plexiglass. I'm sorry, Empowerment, Grant said. His voice was hollow. I know that's not enough. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I am genuinely sorry for what I did to you. Are you sorry you did it, or sorry you got caught? He thought about that. Both, probably. I told myself you were an obstacle, that you were getting in the way of what I deserved. I convinced myself you weren't a real person with real feelings. He looked down at his hands. I was wrong. Yes, you were. How is she, Maya? She's wonderful, smart, funny, kind. She asks about you sometimes. I show her pictures. Nora paused. When you get out, if you want to be in her life, we'll figure it out, but on my terms. Thank you, Grant said quietly. Nora left the prison and drove back to her apartment in Astoria. It was small, but it was hers. She'd rebuilt her architecture practice, focusing on affordable housing and community projects. Her reputation had slowly recovered. People remembered her work, not the scandal. That evening, Ruth came over for dinner. Maya, now 2 years old, ran to her grandmother with open arms. Grandma, Ruth, scooped her up, spinning her around. There's my girl. They made pasta together, the 3 of them in the tiny kitchen. Maya helped stir the sauce, getting more on her shirt than in the pot. Normal, domestic, happy. After Maya was asleep, Ruth and Nora sat on the couch with wine. You did it, Ruth said. You survived him. No, well, Nora corrected gently. I did more than survive. I rebuilt. There's a difference. She thought about the women's shelter she'd designed, the one that finally broke ground last month. She'd added a reading room for children, a space where kids could feel safe while their mothers worked on getting back on their feet. The building would be finished next year. Maya would cut the ribbon with her, a symbol of what came after the darkness. Justice wasn't always swift. Sometimes it took time, patience, and the willingness to play the long game. But it came. And in the end, that was worth everything.